Hi, I'm Jim Clark, Visual Arts Manager here at Hopkins Center for the Arts. Today we're talking with Douglas Oudekerk about his exhibition, Scenes from a Mystery, on view now through December 2nd, 2023. Douglas, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Pleasure. It's fun to be here and all these people to see the show. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Awesome. I just pretend they have very funny hats on.
Oh.
Can you tell us about this particular body of work of yours? It's all noir imagery. Tell us about that.
Well, I grew up in an era of black and white movies and TVs, as I see I have some contemporaries, and I was always kind of fascinated by especially like the serials on TV, the old Alfred Hitchcock Presents or Twilight Zone, and they could have such power as watching them on a little bitty TV, little bitty black and white, poor quality TV, and I just love those shows. I absolutely, and I just always found myself wondering, well, how do they do that? As I had about a 40-some year career in commercial art. And when I would be working, I'd always have old movie channels on. And so I'd find myself being distracted by, sometimes I wouldn't even know what movie was on, but I'd be distracted by the movie and not get a lot of work done for the rest of the afternoon. But I just found myself just intrigued with the kind of the language of noir, the very, the fact that they tell things from a little bit different angle, or they use the light and the shadow to effect where you sort of have to fill in sometimes what's happening in the shadow or what's happening when they're not looking directly at you and talking. And so I found myself, I've always been interested in that kind of visual language. And so when COVID hit, I'd kind of scaled back my commercial work at that point and found myself with a lot more time on my hands, and especially with COVID. And the last few years of my commercial career, I was doing work almost entirely digitally. So I'd gotten away from traditional art materials, and so as an exercise, I just broke out the charcoal, and I started making charcoal drawings. And for inspiration, I started to look at some of these movies because I love the rich contrast and the darks, and that lends itself very well to charcoal. So I just started doing a couple of sketches and was real intrigued by them. And usually they were just, I'd take a snapshot right off the TV, and the ones that I was interested in were the ones that were kind of vague, where you didn't really know what was happening, that there was something going on, but there was enough information that you could tell that it was a person and it was a situation. And I would draw that, and then when I redrew it, I recontextualized it with the title. I found myself really searching for a new sort of circumstance for this picture, or a new story to the picture.
Sure.
And so that's kind of, it started there, and as I did a few of those, I just felt like it was something I just wanted to run with for a while.
Yeah.
And so I just continued drawing them.
Sure. So speaking of the visual language of noir, you're playing with written language in the titles.
Right.
And those titles serve as captions, if you will, for the scene and set up. There's a push-pull there.
Yeah.
Did you come up with, did I hear you correctly in that you came up with the captions after the drawing?
Yeah.
In each and every one?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And so what drove that decision? You sat and looked at the drawing and imagined the scenario that might happen, and it had really nothing to do with the source film.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because through the process of drawing it, they became something else, and I found myself just sort of experimenting with what it could be, and I titled the first few, like one of the first ones I did was, I think it's down at the other end. It's basically a guy in shadow you can't see his face, you can barely make out that it's a person, but he's standing outside a door, and I titled that, he paused by the door, he could hear them arguing. And so I wanted to create a situation where it was open-ended, where it would sort of add something to the context of the image, but leave it wide open as to what's going to happen next, what happened before. And so in that way, I very much wanted to invite the viewer in, to take it and I sort of contextualized it with the caption, but I very much wanted it to be an exploration for the viewer to have fun with.
There's intentional ambiguity there.
Yeah,
The viewer closes that loop. And I imagine that's significantly at odds with the majority of your illustration practice, your commercial art.
Yeah, that's
Can you speak to
that's
that?
a great point, because as a commercial artist, well, I kind of started out as an illustrator illustrating for magazines, and so it was editorial style illustration. So my illustrations were in response to the story, or to augment the story, or to help the story. And so a lot of what I did as an illustrator and a lot of what I did as a commercial artist is very much about the story. The difference is that I'm telling a client's story, or my success as an illustrator was how well I could communicate the client's story, or the story of the magazine, or augment that in some way. And so that's kind of very much been a theme of all my artwork. I'm very much interested in telling a story. And like with these, as I was doing them, I thought of them as very much individual stories. They weren't part of the same narrative, or they weren't, they related to each other visually just when they're together. But it occurred to me that when I had a bunch of them standing around, or in my office as I was doing them, this is kind of like if you took a snapshot in a big city and you had all these stories happening all over the city at the same time. That's sort of what that sort of for me was exciting, because that was like I think there was a famous photographic exhibition where these photographers took a picture at the same time all over the world. And so you had all these pictures of all these things going on. So it really isn't, the title in a way is misleading, because it's not scenes from a mystery, it's scenes from lots of mysteries.
Yeah.
Individual scenes from lots of mysteries.
And you touched on how your commercial art practice trended to almost exclusively, if not exclusively, digital as far as your medium. Right. So the change then, when you changed and focused on your personal work, why not continue in the digital realm? Or maybe you did.
Yeah.
I'm curious about those choices.
Yeah. Well, that's very pertinent question, because there are a lot of things I really liked about working in digital imagery, including the fact that you can, once you create an image digitally, you can do almost anything with it. And so the experimentation is unlimited, really, with it. And so, and I enjoyed that part of it, but I got back to the charcoal to just sort of feel the charcoal and draw on paper again, and just to sort of remember what it was like why I fell in love with drawing in the first place. Yeah. And a series that I'm working on now is combines those two things, where I make a charcoal drawing, but then I scan it and I bring it into the computer and I play with it. And these the images are based mostly on old newspapers, old newspaper stories, old newspaper ads, old newspaper. And these are like 100-year-old newspapers. I'm addicted to going through the history site and going through these old newspapers from early in the 20th century, and all the things they would have in newspapers that we don't have anymore, because their newspapers are dying and the medium is changing. And so I found myself fascinated by I'd come across these individual pictures of people that either did something, or they were, a little story about them, long since forgotten. And most of the time these images were very poor quality. They're like, mimeographed or whatever.
Yep.
And so I got excited about taking some of these kind of crude images and sort of drawing them and realizing them, and sort of kind of reanimating these people.
Sure.
And then once I take that, I bring that into the computer and I sort of recontextualize it within the newspaper so that there's like the original information that appeared with it. And for me, it's really exciting. I really like doing that because that kind of combines two very different mediums, but two mediums I like for different reasons. So
sure. In the digital mediums are so mutable, and you can transform things readily. You can work in layers, and correction is very easy. What are the benefits in your mind to working traditionally?
Well, the benefits for me, I think, are just working with my hands. Working with the materials again, because I started out as an illustrator working with traditional materials, and then I had to adjust to the changes in technology, and so over the course of 40 years, that changed a lot.
Sure.
And so I found myself, if I wanted to continue to be a commercial artist, I had to adapt to what the marketplace was.
Yeah.
And so, kind of kicking and screaming, I went into the digital world, and learned enough where I could, where I didn't have to think about it, where I could start to be creative with it, and that for me is, I'm certainly not a technical person. I learn what I need to learn to get the job done.
Sure.
But the medium itself, the irony of that transition was that when I was an illustrator starting out, and I would make all these works on illustration board or paper or whatever, then usually, and of course they're on deadline, so I'd send them out, and I may never see them again. And a lot of times I would never even get a picture of them because I didn't have time, or I would have to set up a way to photograph them. And so a lot of times the only thing I would see would be the tear sheet of whatever that product was, or what, so I did a lot of that type of work, but the originals were just a lot of the originals were just lost.
Sure.
And when I switched over to digital, of course you have everything then.
Yeah.
And so I have virtually everything I've ever done digitally,
sure.
which I don't necessarily want or need, but it's
terabytes and terabytes of information.
And it's but I also discovered that it's sort of a fine line, because you sort of get into the digital world, and it becomes, there's so many options that it almost becomes paralyzing. And so when I'm working on one of these drawings where I'm combining the two, I retain a lot of the qualities of the charcoal drawing, but then as I'm playing with it, I find myself, I'll save states, of that drawing, because you can do so many things and so quickly and effortlessly that you just are kind of bombarded with all this visual information that it's hard to, you hit on one that is an interesting version, and if you don't save it, you probably can't get back to it as easily. So
totally.
So yeah.
Do you, related to the save state mindset of kind of documenting a period of time in a work so that if something goes awry, you can go back to it. Do you do that with your real space work? Do you photograph work in progress just to kind of document process in general, or also kind of saving states so that if the wheels come off, you can try to recapture that magic?
I haven't done that, but I did that. As a matter of fact, I did my very first time lapse of one of my drawings.
Sure.
That will be can be in the videos to kind of show that process. But I hadn't really thought of it that way, and but I can see the benefit of doing that. Sure. It's just it hasn't been a practice to this point.
Cool. Douglas, other artists that you find inspiring, or you've gained influence from over the years that you admire?
Yeah, I'm influenced a lot by the great illustrators of the early 20th century. From the kind of the golden age of illustration. The N.C. Wyeths and the Oudekerks and they just had there was such a it's so different than it is now, because there was so much illustration everywhere. I mean, it was in magazines and newspapers and you go through any older magazine like that, and some from the 30s, and it's almost all illustration.
Yeah. Frazetta.
Oh yeah, sure.
McGinnis.
Yeah. And other illustrators that I like too, or just for their approach, is like Saul Steinberg, and I just love his kind of irreverent,
Yeah.
And Charles Bragg, I like him too, just for his caricatures of, they're sort of realistic based, but they're caricatures, and they're just really lovely, lovely observations.
Yeah. Within these works, did you feel an impulse or responsibility to change likenesses, or were you aiming for I mean, given that they were coming from Hollywood productions, how did you approach that aspect of it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I really, as I started doing these, I was not interested in the iconic scenes from black and white movies, or even the stars of black and white movies. So if you'll notice in a lot of the illustrations, most of them don't have faces or don't show faces, and a lot of them are of angles that you wouldn't be able to tell who it was, and so I tried to keep it more of an exploration of kind of the language and device of noir, and one of the things that I think kind of characterizes it is when my wife and I were watching a movie a couple weeks ago, Charade, and that's in color, but it's very much a noir film, and it had Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn, and there's this one scene where she goes back to her Paris apartment. Her husband is absconded with everything, and so she's feeling completely despondent, and conveniently Cary Grant shows up at the door, and because he had met her in the Riviera or something, and he shows up at her door, and she moves forward to see him, and she goes completely in shade, so she's in silhouette, and he steps forward to talk to her, and he's completely in shade, and the two of them carry on this conversation. But the thing that was, I mean, these are two of the most photogenic people ever, and they're doing this conversation between them where you can't see either one of their faces, and it had the effect of really focusing you on what they were saying, and also it's like I find myself wondering, what's on her face, what expression does she, you just, and it's just that kind of tension that good noir creates, where they're vague, they leave information out, or they obscure information, so you have to project into it, or it creates a circumstance where you're just a little bit uneased, or you put off a little bit, so you're not sure why, but I thought that was a really good example of some of the things I tried to do with these, where you'd see very little of the person's face, but you find yourself feeling their emotion, and given a little bit of information on the title, just kind of leaving it up to the viewer to kind of fill up that scene, or finish the scene, or so that, it was very much. I was trying to keep the language of the titles very much in the noir world as well.
Yeah.
Just that kind of a clipped, cynical.
There's a rhythm to it.
Yeah, and it is almost like prose in a way that it. I mean, I was trying to do that. Probably less effective than the visual part, but I found that an important part of it, and I really enjoyed doing it.
It's really balancing the proportion of clarity and ambiguity, right? I mean, because if you took it to the extreme, noir could just be a completely black frame with voices,
right?
But you need some visual information to help connect the dots visually and to reinforce the narrative.
Yeah, just to kind of give it enough of a kind of receptacle to put your own impressions into.
process-wise, to go back to that, so you're watching films and something visually grabs you, you get camera out and you take an image, then do you essentially stay pretty true to that image? Do you recrop it or reorganize it? And do each of these, are there multiple studies to get to the final one? Or once you've identified that source image, is it kind of, to the races?
Well, in some cases they were relatively close. In other cases, I did a lot of cropping, and so I'd get a scene that I liked, and a lot of times just zoom in on a part of it. Or there are cases where I combined a couple images, like the woman on the phone, where it's basically you see the nose and the payphone, and that was a couple of images I just kind of combined, and the interesting part about that one too was that originally that close-up of her eye was open, and it was like too much information, and so it just wasn't working for her, and I closed her eye, and then it was like, that's what it is, because then with her eye closed, it became, you can almost feel the sigh or feel the frustration, but with her eye open, it was like too much information. So that's kind of the line I was trying to play with. Sure.
And being as the images are so high contrast and dark and intentionally dark, do you work on a dark ground on black paper and work with white charcoal, or process-wise, what does that look like? And some of these are charcoal and acrylic, so what are the differences there?
Yeah, well, the small drawings are strictly charcoal.
Okay.
And that was one of the reasons I wanted to put them under glass. And when I decided I wanted to scale them up and do bigger ones, then and I really didn't want to put them under glass, and so I basically mounted paper to a panel, white paper to a wooden panel, and then drew on that, and basically did a number of steps of drawing, fixing, because I found that if you fix it and redraw over it, the black gets much deeper, and do that again, it gets much deeper, and then eventually, the black almost becomes layered, where it has a depth to it, and so when I got the drawing to where I wanted it, then I basically sprayed it with like a acrylic fix, and then coated it with varnish, with acrylic varnish. So the acrylic part is the varnish.
In for the drawing nerds, of which there are many here, do you have a favorite brand of fixative?
Well, for most of these, I used a Krylon workable fixative.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be pretty well, because as anybody who does that knows, fixatives make a huge difference. And at first I was a little disappointed with how dark they would get. It would change the charcoal drawing quite a bit when I fixed it, and so I kind of adapted to that and did very light fixes in between stages, and that seemed to help that quite a bit. Cool. But I very definitely went dark on a lot of these, very intentionally.
So even the small drawings without the acrylic, did that start on white paper?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. Yeah. So there was I really, and I liked the idea of really kind of working layer over layer of charcoal. So it was a mostly additive process.
It requires intense commitment.
Yeah. It was kind of, I didn't realize that until I kind of saw them all together. It's kind of, oh my God, look at them all.
For sure.
But it was a lot of fun. I was lost in the movies for a while.
Well, viewers are getting lost in the movies too. Yeah. Let's open it up to questions. Speaking of viewers.
Amazing work.
Oh, thank you.
First question is, do you know when the release date for the feature-length film, based on your drawing, is going to be out? It's great collection.
Oh, thank you.
I'm interested in the cropping that you've done. Example right behind you of it's at an angle. And so all of them have wonderful cropping.
Yeah.
The mystery and whatnot drives that, but there's any number of decisions that you could have made to have gotten to that.
Yeah.
Can you explore?
Yeah, well, I definitely was influenced by, the way that noir movies are cropped, and they crop at a lot of different angles or unusual angles, or and so I very much experimented a lot when if I take a picture off the TV, a lot of times I'd bring it into Photoshop and I'd really play with the cropping and the scaling and the lights and dark, play with the lights and darks sometimes too, and so in a lot of them, like I intentionally cropped out of a lot of faces because I didn't want the distraction of a face. I wanted to leave it a little more ambiguous, give it a little less information, just to kind of, because for me that just created more mystery and more ambiguity, and you're not identifying it with someone, and so that was very intentional too, is that I didn't want it to be a recognizable movie star. I didn't want it to be like a fan art thing. I wanted it to be more about, the way noir essentially manipulates the viewer.
Yeah, visual communication.
Yeah. And they're very intentional, and I love the way that noir will a lot of times have you focus on something that's not, like, you wouldn't think is relevant to the scene. You have two people having a difficult discussion, and you see somebody's hands, a close up on somebody's hands, and it just sort of puts you a little bit, because you have to project what they're looking like and what they're, but you just see enough to know that this is a tough conversation, or this is difficult, or that part of it I really like. It's really intriguing to me to do that. So
these strike me as very Hopper-esque.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
And this is more of a statement than a question. I find myself, as I'm walking by, trying to put together different pieces into a narrative or a story, just to see what I can come up with, and then I scrap it and start somewhere else and go the other direction. It's really been kind of fun.
Yeah. That was, that kind of occurred to me too when I was trying to lay out the show, because I sort of wanted to group them together so that they did interact a little bit with each other, because it's just human nature. You want to connect them, and they look alike, and so and it occurred to me the last several years that I was doing commercial work, I did a lot of storyboard work for TV, and so at one point I'd see all these small drawings that I was working on, and I go, oh my God, I'm doing a noir storyboard. That's what I'm doing. And but for me that felt very, very comfortable, and especially with the storyboard, of course you want the story to be very apparent. And with this, I'm trying to obscure the story in a way. I'm just trying, or I make it open and ended enough where it could go any number of different ways, or it's kind of up to you to make that story. So that was very, very much a part of the fun for me, is see how it put two of them up together, and they look totally different if you put two different ones up together. And that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing that.
Were there any lessons that you learned from your commercial art career, or habits that you cultivated during that time that you wish you could unlearn now that you're focusing on your own work?
Sure.
Or maybe it's all positive.
Yeah. Well, I think on the positive side, one of the things I discovered doing this was that I like doing series. I like exploring a theme or taking it, as I did with this one, and so I found that part of it is, as I think of myself more as a fine artist now than a commercial artist, is there are themes I would really like to explore, because I think it gets you where you end up is a much different place where you start. It evolves as you go, and you find yourself reacting to what you've done so far, and so but still keeping it within a kind of a general theme. So that part, I think I'm kind of used to, especially as working as a storyboard artist. But as far as I think if I was to talk about a negative from working as a commercial artist, I think as a commercial artist, because it was a job, that I was very concerned with having a successful piece that solved the client's problem. And so I think to that extent, the image itself suffered because I found out ways to fix things and shortcuts to get things done. And so I found myself, when I started working with traditional materials again, some of these I don't know enough about. You know, I sort of, my education sort of truncated when I started illustrating because I found things that worked as an illustrator, and but a lot of times they were shortcuts. A lot of times they were, ways that you found to kind of fix an image just to satisfy a requirement. And so in that part, I find myself becoming more interested in, the disciplines of drawing, the disciplines of painting that I kind of put on a shelf for a long time.
Good stuff. Other questions? Arlene.
Hi, my question is, what type of paper do you use in the process?
Well, I just started out with, when I just started the small drawings, it was just a standard like Strathmore sketchbook, sketch paper. And I found as I wanted to scale them up a little bit, that I wanted a little bit heavier paper. And so I ended up buying just a roll of a heavier weight Strathmore.
Was it more like a Bristol or?
Yeah, it was like, it was a cold press paper, but so it had a little bit of tooth to it, but not a lot. And it was pretty rugged. So, and I figured out how to mount on a wooden panel without bubbles, which took a little while. but yeah, I found that was a nice surface to work on because, especially, working these drawings, I work them pretty hard, and I really grind in the darks, and for the most part, drawing and fixing and drawing and fixing, and I probably went through on each of the medium-sized ones probably 4 or 5 stages of adding darks to it. So that the darks ended up very, very dark.
But that's pretty interesting because most of your works look so smooth if you use textured paper.
Yeah.
Is it from building?
Yeah,
up
there's not much tooth to it. It's
okay.
relatively smooth. Yeah, it's not hot press, but it's relatively smooth paper. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, when you were talking about illustration, the problem with illustration.
Oh, sure.
And you knew the tricks or whatever.
Oh, sure.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know any of the tricks.
Oh, yeah.
Just kind of
Yeah.
wondering what is the difference?
Yeah. Well, I think when I first started illustrating, there were certain like styles of illustration that commercial artists use, like a certain style of ink drawing or a certain style of, or they use certain materials like dyes or fast drying gouache, or they couldn't wait around for oil to dry, in a lot of cases. And so I found myself kind of learning enough to make a decent image, that would satisfy the customer's needs. And then a lot of times that was, it wasn't a great image, but it got the job done, and it got me paid, and I got to move on to the next. And so in that way, you sort of learn that kind of workflow. And I found that, after a while, you do enough of that, and you feel like, well, I just want to make something for myself again, Yeah. I mean, that's why I started doing it in the first place. And so there would be times during my career where I took a break, or I'd take a week-long workshop, or I'd go to, just make, I went to a monoprint class one time, and I'd never done monoprint, and it was totally different than what I was doing because we were just, putting, inking up plates and running them through the press, and it was all completely abstract, and it was, but for me, it was just like a breath of fresh air. It's just like, oh, this is wonderful. I'm not worried about what the illustration has to be and how to get there. I'm just starting to make an image and let the go with that. So I think that's a difference in focus, that as a commercial artist or an illustrator, that you sort of, a mindset difference that, and now it's like the things that I draw are the things that I want to draw, which is a very different thing. And so you have to, At this point, I don't really want to draw something I don't want to draw, or if I'm not having fun doing it, it's like, and that's that's why these sort of took off, because I just started drawing the small ones, and they're just fun. They're fun to do, and then they're fun to sort of come up with a story behind them. As I did them, they were, okay, what's this guy up to? And that part of it I really like doing too. So.
Okay, thanks. Great.
Sure.
I just have a question on what type of charcoal you use.
Well,
I assume black and white.
Yeah. I started like with a range of grayscale charcoals that I used for a while, and then I found these they're called pan pastels, I think, that are basically discs, and I started using those, and those were really fun. I really enjoyed working with those, and so probably about halfway through I made the shift to making most of them with those, and I'd still use still use the stick charcoals, but those were wonderful for like blocking in areas, and there was a lot of times where I had to kind of, if something would go too dark, I had to sort of layer it back with lighter charcoal, and so I found I could do that with the multiple kind of fixing and redoing and fixing and redoing. I could kind of pull areas back up, but most of them have multiple layers of charcoal on them.
It strikes me that you started illustrating stories, and now you're using illustrating and inviting us to create the story. So it's a reverse.
Yeah.
And so where do you suspect that freedom that you're discovering will take us?
As a viewer, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, what I hope it does is that I hope when you see an image that visually you're drawn to it, so you kind of want to say, okay, what's happening? And when you read the context or the title, I'm hoping, okay, that gives you a little bit of information, but not much, and it's enough to kind of make you wonder. So yeah, I'm very much asking the viewer to complete the story or to add to the story, my dream is that somebody will come along and they'll say, oh, I need about 20 of these on a wall, and I'm just going to keep moving them every day.
So where do you think in the future your art, where do you suspect the freedom that you're found with these, where will your art take you?
Well, I love the story aspect of it. I mean, for me, the type of art that I do is very much informed by storytelling and telling a story, and even with the ones I was telling about the newspapers, I mean, I love these interesting little clips I come across in these old newspapers, and there was one in particular that I did a drawing of, and it was this guy sitting on a great big metal drum, and it underneath the cut line underneath the photo was I forgot what his name was. But he said he had gone over Niagara Falls 10 times, and he said he was not going to do it again unless more money was forthcoming. And then the last line was, he's 59 years old. I mean, it was just, I just came across that little clip in an old newspaper, and it just charmed me. I just thought, I got to draw this guy. And, it was a horrible photo, so, it was very degraded. And but that part of, diving in and trying to really kind of actualize this person was a lot of fun, and it sort of really made him real. And so much, especially like our history, and I'm very interested in history as well. But so much of our history, when we think of that era, is just that. It's flat, black and white, bad copies. But the stories are people's stories. The stories are, they had just as rich a life as we did, just in a very different way. It's just the way that we see them is so limited because of the media, and so in that way, drawing pictures like that, that's sort of the next series I'm working on. But that kind of process for me is really fun to do. It just kind of brings history alive a little bit for me, but it also exposes me to all the, what people were doing and what they were thinking about and what was newsworthy. And, it's fascinating. I get lost in that archive all the time, just flipping through old newspapers and of course, there were tons of them. There were, especially in Minnesota, there were Norwegian newspapers, there were Swedish newspapers, there were black newspapers, it was just, when we remodeled, my wife and I remodeled our old house, it was about a 100-year-old house, and there was a mud porch that was built in the 40s, and I decided to save money. I'm going to demo this room myself. Big mistake, one emergency room visit. But anyway, when I took the lath and plaster down, and I started to take it down, and all these newspapers from the 40s, and there were Sunday newspapers, Sunday Tribunes, and they were all intact. They were just extra newspapers. People would put them in their walls for insulation. And I would pull these newspapers out, and they were like January 1939, and they were Sunday editions, and they had 8 pages of color comics. 8 pages. And there were classics, for me, that was just like all work stopped, and I just started pulling these newspapers out and salvaging what I could, and it was just like this incredible time capsule that, and I still have some of those newspapers sitting in a flat file that I couldn't bear to part with, but they're just lovely.
If you want some more newspapers.
Oh, I do.
I'll give you the address, because my dad did that.
Oh, really?
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It's just what a very specific time capsule too, because it was just like these were all within a week of January 1st, 1939, and it's just, oh my gosh, I get lost in here.
One last question. I'm guessing we're nearing the end here. Will your future explorations include any other mediums? Ink?
Oh,
Who knows what it could be?
I'm very. I originally went to school and majored in printmaking back in the day, and there are aspects of printmaking that I really like, especially now, because the practice of printmaking is wide open in a way it hasn't ever been. Especially when I was learning it back in the 70s, and I've taken classes, and I've frequented High Point a number of times, and I would very much like to. Some of my images, I think, would translate very well to prints, and some in traditional media, but some in mixed printmaking media too. And so, I'd very much like to, at some point, if I can figure it out, just join the co-op and start making prints down there. I would really enjoy doing that. So, and if you've never been, please go. It's an amazing place. So.
Douglas, thanks so much for sharing your work with our community.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with Douglas Oudekerk about his exhibition, Scenes from a Mystery, on view now through December 2nd, 2023, in the upper floor lobby gallery. All right.